He was an injured veteran limping through a forgotten town, mocked for buying the one house everyone said was cursed. They laughed when he started tearing down walls with his own scarred hands, called him crazy for believing in something no one else could see. But when he finally broke through to the room that had been sealed for 70 years, what he found inside wasn't just worth $250 million. It was proof that sometimes the most broken things hold the greatest treasures. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning fog clung to the streets of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, like a secret refusing to let go. Jake Turner sat in his beat-up Ford truck outside the real estate office, his right hand gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. His leg throbbed with the dull, persistent ache that had become his constant companion over the past 3 years, a souvenir from an IED outside Kandahar that had ended his military career and shattered more than just bone and muscle. It had shattered the life he'd planned, the future he'd promised his wife, the man he thought he'd always be. He was 38 years old, but when he looked in the mirror, a much older man stared back. Gray threaded through his dark brown hair at the temples. Lines carved deep around his eyes told stories of desert sun, sleepless nights, and the kind of pain that doesn't show up on medical charts. His shoulders, once squared with military precision, now carried an invisible weight that bent him forward ever so slightly. The posture of a man who'd lost too much and was still trying to figure out how to stand upright again. In the passenger seat sat a worn manila folder containing every dollar he had left in the world. $34,000. It represented 3 years of disability checks, careful budgeting that bordered on deprivation, and the life insurance payout from when Sarah died. His wife, even 2 years later, thinking those words felt like swallowing broken glass. Car accident, black ice. Gone in an instant while he was at a VA appointment, unable to save her, unable to do anything except identify her body and try to explain to their 12-year-old daughter why Mommy wasn't coming home. Jake forced himself to breathe slowly, the way the therapist at the VA had taught him. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. But breathing exercises couldn't fix what was really broken. They couldn't bring Sarah back. They couldn't make his leg whole again. They couldn't erase the nightmares that jerked him awake at 3 in the morning, his heart pounding, his body covered in cold sweat, thinking he was back in that Humvee, watching the world explode in a bloom of fire and screaming metal. He grabbed the folder and climbed out of the truck, his movements careful and deliberate. The limp was worse in cold weather, worse in the morning, worse when he'd been sitting too long. Which meant it was pretty much always worse, but Jake had learned to work around pain the same way he'd learned to work around loss. You acknowledged it, then you kept moving anyway because stopping meant drowning. The bell above the real estate office door chimed as he entered. Linda Patterson looked up from her desk, and Jake saw the familiar expression cross her face, the one that mixed pity with discomfort, sympathy with uncertainty. It was the look everyone in Millbrook gave him these days. Poor Jake Turner. Lost his leg to war, lost his wife to fate, raising that sad little girl all alone. What a tragedy. What a shame. Jake had learned to hate that look more than he hated the pain in his leg. "Jake," Linda said, standing quickly, smoothing her skirt with nervous hands. She was in her mid-50s, had sold houses in Millbrook for 30 years, and knew every property's history like other people knew family gossip. "You said on the phone you wanted to talk about the Ashford place." "I want to buy it," Jake said directly, moving to the chair across from her desk and lowering himself carefully. His leg didn't bend quite right anymore, and sitting required a specific angle or the pain would shoot up his spine like lightning. Linda's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. "Jake, I have to be honest with you. That house has been sitting empty for 15 years. The foundation has issues, the roof needs complete replacement, there's probably black mold in half the walls, the plumbing is from the 1930s. "How much?" Jake interrupted quietly. She hesitated, fingers tapping on a thick folder that presumably contained all the reasons why no sane person would buy the Ashford house. The bank is asking $32,000. They just want it off their books at this point. But Jake, you haven't even seen inside yet. You haven't had any kind of inspection. That place has a reputation. I know the reputation, Jake said. I grew up in this town, remember? I heard all the stories about Walter Ashford going crazy in that house, about how he sealed up rooms and talked to ghosts, about how people who go in there hear voices in the walls. I've heard every version of the curse story since I was 10 years old. Linda leaned forward, her expression earnest. Then why on earth would you want to buy it? Jake thought about the cramped 2-bedroom apartment where he and Emma had been living for the past 2 years. The thin walls that did nothing to muffle his nightmares. The way Emma had stopped decorating her room because it didn't feel like home, just a temporary stop on the way to somewhere else. The look in her brown eyes that said she'd given up hoping for anything permanent, anything stable, anything that felt like the life they'd had before everything fell apart. Because my daughter needs a real home, Jake said simply. And I need a project, something to work on. Something to fix. Linda studied him for a long moment, and Jake could see her trying to decide if this was therapeutic determination or self-destructive desperation. Finally, she sighed and opened the folder. All right, let me get the paperwork started. But Jake, I want you to promise me you'll at least look inside before you finalize anything. I promise, Jake lied. He'd already driven past the house 17 times over the past month. He'd studied it from every angle, walked the perimeter of the property, examined the foundation from the outside. He didn't need to see the interior to know it was a disaster. He needed a disaster. He needed something so broken that fixing it would require every ounce of his attention, every scrap of his skill, every hour of his day. He needed something that would stop him from thinking about the things he couldn't fix. By early afternoon, Jake stood in front of the Ashford place with Emma at his side. His daughter was 12 years old but looked younger, small for her age, with her mother's auburn hair that caught the light like copper wire, and her father's stubborn jaw that squared when she was trying not to cry. She'd been quiet since Sarah died, the kind of silence that worried teachers and had school counselors calling Jake for concerned conferences. The bright, chattering girl who'd filled their house with laughter and knock-knock jokes had retreated somewhere deep inside, and Jake didn't know how to coax her back out. The house loomed before them like something from a Gothic novel that had been left out in the rain too long. 3 stories of Victorian architecture with a tower on one corner that leaned slightly to the left as if the house itself was tired of standing upright. The paint, which might have been gray or might have been white or might have been some other color entirely 50 years ago, peeled away in long strips like dead skin. The wraparound porch sagged in the middle, its boards warped and split. Windows on the 2nd and 3rd floors were boarded over with plywood that had weathered to the color of driftwood. Vines thick as Jake's wrist had claimed the chimneys, wrapping around brick like they were trying to strangle the house or hold it together, he couldn't tell which. The iron fence that surrounded the property leaned at impossible angles, some sections flat on the ground, others still upright but listing like drunken soldiers. The yard was a jungle of overgrown grass, weeds that reached past Jake's waist, and bushes that had evolved into trees over years of neglect. It looked exactly like what it was, a place everyone had given up on. "It's really big," Emma said softly. Her voice had that careful quality it always carried now, like she was testing each word before she let it out, afraid of saying something wrong, something that might make things worse. "It is," Jake agreed, trying to keep his own voice steady, trying to sound confident instead of terrified about what he'd just done. "It needs a lot of work." "Can we really fix it?" Emma asked, and Jake heard what she wasn't saying. "Can we fix anything? Can broken things become whole again? Is there any point in trying?" Jake looked down at his daughter, at the hope flickering in her eyes like a candle flame in a storm, so fragile, so easily extinguished. He thought about his toolbox in the truck, about the engineering skills the Army had drilled into him during his 8 years of service, about the desperate, clawing need to build something after 3 years of feeling like everything in his life was falling apart. "Yeah, baby," he said, putting his hand on her shoulder. "We can fix it. It'll take time, and it'll be hard, but we can do it. You and me together." Emma leaned against his side, and Jake felt her small body relax slightly, as if she'd been holding tension he didn't even know was there. "Together," she repeated quietly. They walked up the cracked concrete path toward the front door, weeds pushing through every gap, and Jake fitted the key Linda had given him into the rusted lock. It took some effort, the mechanism hadn't been turned in years, but finally it clicked. The door swung inward with a groan that sounded almost human, releasing a breath of stale air that smelled of rot and time, and secrets kept too long. Inside was worse than Jake had imagined and somehow better at the same time. Dust covered every surface in thick blankets. The air tasted old and still, like breathing in a tomb. But underneath the neglect, underneath the years of abandonment, Jake could see traces of what the house had once been. Crown molding lined the high ceilings, 12 feet at least. The floors were hardwood beneath the grime, wide planks of what looked like oak or maple. The staircase curved upward in an elegant sweep, its banister carved with intricate details that had survived decades of neglect. Crystal doorknobs caught the light filtering through gaps in the boarded windows, throwing tiny rainbows across dusty walls. "Someone loved this place once," Emma observed, running her finger through the dust on a side table, leaving a clean line like a scar. "Yeah," Jake agreed, looking around with his engineer's eye, already cataloging what needed to be done, what could be saved, what would need to be completely replaced. Someone did. By the time they drove back through town, word had already spread. Millbrook was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business before the actual participants did. The waitress at Murphy's Diner had a cousin who worked at the bank. The bank teller had a sister who played bridge with Linda Patterson. Linda Patterson had mentioned just in passing at the grocery store to Margaret the librarian that Jake Turner had actually gone through with it. He'd bought the Ashford house. By dinner time, every table at Murphy's was buzzing with the news. "Heard Jake Turner bought the old Ashford place," said William, the pharmacist, shaking his head over his meatloaf. "That poor man has more problems than sense." "Lost his wife, barely walking straight, and now he's taking on that money pit?" added Margaret, spreading butter on her roll with sharp, decisive strokes. "It's more than a money pit. It's cursed. Everyone knows it." "My grandfather used to say Walter Ashford went mad in that house," chimed in Rick from the hardware store, the kind of man who spoke loudly because he assumed everyone wanted to hear his opinions. "Sealed up rooms, talked to people who weren't there, wrote gibberish on the walls. The place drove him insane, and then he just disappeared one day. Walked into the woods and never came back. Found his body 6 months later," William added helpfully, "or what was left of it after the animals got to him." They all nodded sagely, comfortable in their certainty that Jake Turner was making a terrible mistake, that the house was beyond saving, that the veteran with the dead wife and the sad little girl was just adding another tragedy to his collection. But Jake didn't hear their words that night. He sat at the wobbly kitchen table in their cramped apartment while Emma slept in the next room, her breathing soft and steady through the thin walls. The house's blueprints were spread out in front of him, yellowed pages that Linda had included in the closing documents, dated 1947, updated from the original 1887 plans. Jake traced the rooms with his finger, studying the layout, the measurements, the strange notations written in faded pencil in the margins. His engineering training kicked in automatically. He saw load-bearing walls, traced the plumbing routes, identified where the electrical would need complete replacement. But something about the layout bothered him, nagged at his mind like a loose tooth. The dimensions didn't quite add up. Rooms that should have been larger appeared smaller on the plans. Hallways that seemed to go one direction on paper actually ran another way in reality. It was as if whoever had done the 1947 renovations had deliberately made the blueprints not quite match the actual house. Jake rubbed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at him. His leg throbbed worse than usual. He'd been on it too much today, pushed himself too hard. But he couldn't stop staring at those blueprints, couldn't shake the feeling that the house was hiding something, that Walter Ashford had left some kind of puzzle for someone to solve. But he was too tired to figure it out tonight. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The next morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of autumn day that promised winter wasn't far behind. Jake and Emma loaded up the truck with tools he'd borrowed from Tyler, one of the few guys from his army unit who'd stayed in touch after Jake's medical discharge. The truck bed rattled with hammers, pry bars, work lights, boxes of nails, and enough determination to move mountains, or at least patch a severely damaged roof. "Dad," Emma said as they drove through town toward the house, her voice small and uncertain. "Why do people keep staring at us?" Jake had noticed it too. Mrs. Sandra at the corner store had watched them load the truck with a mixture of pity and judgment, shaking her head slowly. The teenagers pumping gas at the Sunoco station had whispered and pointed, phones out to probably post about it on social media. Crazy vet buying haunted house. Even Father Michael from the Lutheran church had pulled his car alongside theirs at a red light and leaned out his window to ask with concerned eyes if Jake was absolutely certain about this decision. "Because people are scared of things they don't understand," Jake said, turning onto Maple Street. "And they don't understand why anyone would want to fix something this broken. They think broken means worthless. They think if something's hard to fix, it's not worth the effort." "But you don't think that," Emma said. It wasn't quite a question. "No, baby, I don't think that at all." They pulled up in front of the house, and Jake sat for a moment, just looking at it in the gray morning light. It looked even worse than yesterday. Or maybe he was just seeing it more clearly now that the adrenaline of the purchase had worn off. The reality of what he'd taken on settled over him like a heavy blanket. $32,000. Every cent he had. No safety net, no backup plan. Just him, his limp, his toolbox, and a house that might actually be trying to kill anyone stupid enough to try restoring it. "We can do this," Emma said suddenly. And when Jake looked over, his daughter was staring at the house with an expression he hadn't seen on her face in 2 years. Determination. "You said we could. Together." And just like that, Jake's fear transformed into something else, something harder, something that tasted like purpose. "Yeah," he said, climbing out of the truck. "Together." They spent the first hour just walking through the house more thoroughly than yesterday's quick tour, Jake making detailed notes while Emma explored with the careful curiosity of a child who'd been disappointed too many times to trust excitement completely. Every room revealed new problems and unexpected potential in equal measure. The ceilings soared high and elegant, but water stains mapped the plaster like continents of damage. The windows were original leaded glass, beautiful and valuable, but half the frames had rotted through. The kitchen was a disaster of 1930s appliances and 70 years of neglect, but underneath the rust and grime, Jake could see the bones of something magnificent. Custom cabinetry, soapstone counters, a brick hearth big enough to roast a whole pig. "Someone put a lot of money into this place once," Jake said, running his hand over the carved woodwork in what had been a formal dining room. "This isn't standard construction. This is craftsmanship, real skill." "So what happened?" Emma asked. "Why did they leave it like this?" Jake thought about the stories, about Walter Ashford living here alone for 50 years, about his strange behavior and eventual disappearance. "I think maybe the owner got old, got overwhelmed, couldn't keep up with it anymore, and then when he was gone, nobody wanted to take it on." "Until you," Emma said. "Until us," Jake corrected. By noon, they'd started the actual work. Jake couldn't do heavy lifting anymore. His back and leg wouldn't allow the kind of strain that real construction demanded. But he could plan, measure, direct, and do detailed work that required precision rather than power. Emma, it turned out, was surprisingly good with tools. She had her mother's careful attention to detail and her father's stubborn refusal to quit when things got difficult. They started with the front porch, tearing out the sections of wood that had rotted beyond saving. Jake showed Emma how to use a pry bar properly, how to find the nails holding boards down, how to work systematically so you didn't accidentally compromise the whole structure. She learned fast, barely complaining when she got splinters or when her arms got tired. That's when the spectators started arriving. First came Tommy from 2 houses down, a man in his 50s who'd lived on this street his entire life and considered himself an expert on everything, despite having accomplished very little. He leaned against his mailbox, arms crossed over his chest, watching them work with an expression that mixed amusement with condescension. Then came the Patterson twins, teenagers with expensive bikes and time to waste, sitting at the curb, phones out, probably filming for TikTok or whatever platform kids used to mock things they didn't understand. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, half a dozen neighbors had found reasons to walk past, slow down, and stare. Jake tried to ignore them, focusing on pulling nails from warped boards, but he heard their whispers clearly enough. His military hearing, trained to detect distant threats, picked up every word even when they thought they were being subtle. Complete waste of time and money. "House'll fall down around his ears before he gets even halfway done. Should have just bulldozed the place years ago, put up condos or something useful. That veteran, the one with the dead wife, he's really lost it now." Emma heard them too. Her small hands faltered on the hammer she'd been using to tap loose a stubborn nail. Jake saw tears threatening to spill from her eyes, saw her chin tremble with the effort of holding them back. "Hey," he said softly, moving to sit beside her on the porch steps, his legs screaming at the sudden change in position. "You know what people said about me in the army?" She shook her head, wiping at her eyes with the back of her dirty hand, leaving a smudge of dust across her cheek. "They said I was crazy for volunteering for explosive ordnance disposal, said I had a death wish, that only insane people chose to spend their days disarming IEDs and unexploded ordnance. You know what I told them?" "What?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "I said that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose to believe in something everyone else has given up on. That sometimes faith looks like foolishness from the outside, but on the inside, it's the only thing that makes sense." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "We're not doing this for them, Emma. We're doing this for us, because we need to prove to ourselves that broken things can be fixed, that giving up isn't the only option when life gets hard." Emma nodded slowly, scrubbing the last of the tears away. "Mom would have liked this project, wouldn't she?" Jake's throat tightened painfully. Sarah had loved old houses, had dragged him to historical home tours on dates, had dreamed about restoring a Victorian someday. They'd talked about it late at night in bed, planning the colors they'd paint the walls, arguing about whether to keep period fixtures or update for convenience, imagining the life they'd build inside those restored rooms. "Yeah, baby," he managed to say. She would have absolutely loved it. Emma picked up her hammer with renewed determination and went back to work. Jake watched her for a moment, pride swelling in his chest so powerfully it almost hurt. Then he grabbed his pry bar and joined her, ignoring the pain, ignoring the whispers, ignoring everything except the work in front of him. The first week crawled by in a blur of splinters, sore muscles, and constant commentary from the town. Rick at the hardware store made a big show of discounting materials for Jake when other customers were around, his voice loud enough to carry across the whole store. "Veteran discount, plus an extra 10% for that Ashford project. You're going to need all the help you can get with that money pit." The ladies at the church organized a prayer circle specifically for Jake's misguided project. discussing it at coffee hour after Sunday service with voices full of concern and eyes bright with gossip. Even the local newspaper ran a piece titled "Local Veteran Takes on Millbrook's Most Notorious Property," with photos that made the house look like something from a horror movie and quotes from neighbors expressing hope that Jake knows what he's getting into. Jake read the article once, jaw clenched, then crumpled it up and used it to line his toolbox. By the second week, he'd replaced the dangerous sections of the porch and started on the roof. His legs screamed at him every single night, the pain radiating from his damaged knee all the way up his spine and down to his ankle. But he learned to work around it, to move carefully, to take breaks when his body demanded them even when his mind wanted to push through. He learned to accept Tyler's help when his old army buddy stopped by after his shift at the factory, bringing pizza and fresh muscle for the jobs Jake couldn't manage alone. "They're taking bets at Murphy's Diner," Tyler said one evening, hammering new shingles beside Jake as the sun set in streaks of orange and pink. "Bets on what?" Jake asked, though he could guess. "How long before you give up? 6 months is the over-under." Tyler grinned, his dark face creasing with amusement. "Most people are betting the under. They think you'll be done by Christmas, sell the place at a loss, move on." Jake paused, nail gun in hand, and looked at his old friend. "What did you bet?" Tyler's grin widened. $20 says you'll still be here in 5 years. I know you, man. I've seen you defuse IEDs while people were actively shooting at us. I've seen you walk on a broken leg for 6 miles to get the squad back to base. You're too damn stubborn to quit just because people are laughing." That night, Jake sat on the newly repaired porch steps with Emma, sharing sandwiches from the deli and watching the sun disappear behind the hills. The house still looked rough. There was no denying that. But it looked less like a corpse and more like something that might, with enough care and determination, remember how to breathe. "Dad?" Emma said, her voice cutting through the comfortable silence. "Yeah, baby? Do you think Mom would be proud of what we're doing?" Jake's chest constricted. Sarah had always loved old houses, had dreamed about restoration projects, had possessed an almost spiritual belief in the power of bringing forgotten beauty back to life. He'd promised her during those late-night conversations in bed when the world felt safe and the future seemed certain that someday they'd do exactly this, buy an old house and restore it together piece by piece, room by room. But life had other plans. The IED, the medical discharge, the car accident that took her before they could fulfill any of those dreams. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I think she'd love it. I think she'd be right here with us, arguing about paint colors and insisting we save every piece of original trim, even if it means 10 times more work." Emma smiled, a real smile, the kind Jake hadn't seen nearly enough of in the past 2 years. She'd definitely want to save everything original. She always said modern stuff had no soul. They sat together in the gathering darkness, father and daughter, eating gas station sandwiches on the steps of a house everyone said was cursed. And for the first time since Sarah died, Jake felt something that almost resembled peace. Not happiness. He wasn't sure he'd ever feel genuinely happy again, but a sense of rightness, of purpose, of moving in a direction that mattered. By the 3rd week, Jake had worked his way inside, tackling the first floor room by room. He started with the main parlor, pulling down sections of damaged plaster to expose the structure beneath. The work was dirty, exhausting, and revealing. Every wall he opened showed him something new about the house's history. Old newspapers from the 1960s used as insulation, horsehair plaster from the original 1887 construction, hand-hewn studs that had been shaped with axes rather than saws. It was like archaeology, peeling back layers of time to reveal the skeleton of something that had once been magnificent. Emma came every day after school, doing her homework in corners Jake had cleaned, helping with tasks that didn't require heavy lifting, slowly transforming from a quiet, withdrawn girl into someone who spoke more, smiled occasionally, and seemed to be finding her way back to herself through the work of restoration. But the mockery didn't stop. If anything, it intensified as the reality of the project's scope became apparent. My grandfather always said that house was possessed, Sandra from the corner store told her customers loudly whenever Jake came in for supplies. Said Walter Ashford made a deal with the devil and that's how he got so rich, then the devil came to collect. I heard Jake found bodies in the walls, someone claimed at the gas station, though Jake had found nothing of the sort. It's a shame, really, Margaret the librarian said at book club. That poor man using his disability money on a house that'll never be worth what he's putting into it, and dragging that little girl through it. Someone should call child services. The whispers followed Jake everywhere. In line at the grocery store, at Emma's parent-teacher conferences, even at the VA clinic when he went for his monthly check-in. People looked at him differently now, with a mixture of pity and judgment that said they thought he'd finally broken completely, that the combination of war, trauma, and grief had driven him over an edge he'd never climb back from. But Father Michael showed up one Saturday morning with coffee and donuts, climbing carefully onto the porch where Jake was working on window frames. "Jake," the old priest said, settling onto a sawhorse with a grunt, "I wanted to apologize." Jake looked up from the window he'd been scraping, surprised. "For what, Father?" "For doubting you. Half the parish thinks I'm crazy for not talking you out of this. But I've been watching you work, watching Emma come back to life, and I realized something." He gestured at the house with his coffee cup. "This isn't about real estate. This is about resurrection." Jake felt something crack open in his chest. Something that had been locked tight since Sarah died. "Everyone thinks I'm insane." "Maybe you are," Father Michael said with a gentle smile. "But Jesus was crazy too, loving people who didn't deserve it, believing in redemption when everyone else saw only ruins, insisting that death wasn't the end of the story. Sometimes crazy is just another word for faith." After the priest left, Jake stood alone on the porch for a long time, looking at the house with new eyes. Father Michael was right. This wasn't about property values or construction projects. This was about proving that broken things, broken houses, broken bodies, broken hearts could still become whole again. That giving up wasn't the only option when life shattered your plans. By the end of the first month, Jake had made visible, undeniable progress. The roof was patched and no longer leaked. The porch was solid, its boards level and safe. The windows on the first floor were no longer boarded. He'd repaired the frames and cleaned the original glass until it sparkled. The house still looked rough, still needed months of work, but it no longer looked abandoned. It looked inhabited, claimed, loved. And Jake Turner, the man everyone had written off as a fool throwing good money after bad intentions, felt something he hadn't felt since before the explosion that shattered his leg and the accident that shattered his heart. He felt purpose. What Jake didn't know yet, what none of them could possibly know, was that the house had been waiting for exactly this. Waiting for someone stubborn enough to look past the surface, skilled enough to understand its secrets, and desperate enough to keep digging even when everyone told him to stop. Because sealed behind a wall in the East Wing, hidden for 70 years behind brick and plaster and silence, was something that would change everything, something that would prove the mockery wrong, vindicate his faith, and reveal that sometimes the most cursed places hold the greatest treasures. But first, Jake had to find it. And finding it would require him to trust his instincts, ignore the doubters, and tear down one more wall. The wall everyone told him to leave alone, the wall that didn't quite make sense, the wall that called to him in ways he couldn't explain, the wall that would transform a broken veteran's desperate gamble into the discovery of a lifetime. November arrived in Millbrook with the kind of cold that seeped into old bones and older houses. Jake stood in what had once been the main parlor, now stripped down to studs and subflooring, and studied his progress chart. He'd divided the house into zones, prioritizing based on structural necessity rather than aesthetics. First the roof and foundation, the envelope that kept weather out. Then the mechanical systems, plumbing, electrical, heating. Only after those bones were solid would he worry about the pretty stuff like paint and fixtures. It was the same methodology he'd used in the army when his unit had rebuilt infrastructure in Afghanistan. Start with what keeps people alive, then move to what makes life worth living. The difference was that in Afghanistan he'd had a team of 20 soldiers and civilian contractors. Here he had himself, a 12-year-old girl, and the occasional help from Tyler when his buddy could spare an evening. But Jake worked with a methodical precision that surprised even him. His body might be broken, but his mind was still sharp, still capable of breaking down complex problems into manageable steps. Each morning he'd arrive at the house before Emma's school started, make a pot of coffee in the thermos he'd brought, and spend an hour just studying whatever room he was tackling that day. He'd take measurements, compare them to the blueprints, make notes about load-bearing walls and hidden utilities. Then he'd work until his leg forced him to stop, usually around noon, take his pain medication, rest for 30 minutes, and start again. By the time Emma arrived at 3:30, he'd have accomplished what most contractors would bill as a full day's work. The dining room ceiling had revealed itself to be a work of art beneath decades of water damage. Original pressed tin, embossed with an intricate floral pattern, now carefully restored panel by panel. Jake had spent a week on his back on a ladder, his damaged leg hanging at an awkward angle, cleaning each square foot with cotton swabs and mineral spirits until the pattern emerged like a photograph in a dark room. "It's beautiful," Emma had whispered when he'd finished, staring up at the ceiling that now gleamed softly in the work lights. "It was always beautiful," Jake had replied, "just hidden under all that damage. Sometimes you have to trust that there's something worth saving underneath the mess." He hadn't been talking about just the ceiling, and Emma had seemed to understand that. The kitchen had required complete gutting. The 1930s appliances were beyond saving, riddled with rust and home to generations of mice. But underneath the grime, Jake found treasure, custom cabinetry made from walnut with dovetail joints so precise they'd barely shifted in 90 years. A soapstone sink, massive and deep, that cleaned up to reveal smooth gray stone. A butler's pantry with built-in storage that showed the kind of craftsmanship that didn't exist anymore. Jake salvaged what he could, documented everything, worked with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be and nothing else to prove except that broken things could be made whole again. Emma became his unexpected partner in the restoration. At first, Jake had tried to keep her involvement minimal. She was 12, still grieving her mother, still dealing with school and the normal pressures of adolescence. But Emma had insisted, showing up every afternoon with her backpack full of homework and a determination that mirrored his own. "I want to help," she'd said one day, her jaw set in that stubborn line she'd inherited from him. "I want to be part of this." So Jake taught her. He showed her how to use a level properly, how to read a tape measure down to the 16th of an inch, how to identify different types of wood by their grain patterns. He taught her about load-bearing walls and why you couldn't just knock down anything you wanted. He explained the logic of plumbing, the flow of electricity, the physics of how a house actually stood upright and didn't collapse. Emma absorbed it all like a sponge. She had her mother's attention to detail and her father's spatial reasoning. Within weeks, she could hand Jake the exact tool he needed before he asked for it, could spot structural problems he might have missed, could work alongside him for hours with the comfortable silence of a true teammate. Their relationship, which had been strained and careful since Sarah's death, both of them tiptoeing around their grief, afraid to burden the other, began to knit itself back together through the shared work. They talked while they sanded. They planned while they painted. They dreamed while they rebuilt, imagining what each room would become, how the house would look when it was finally finished. "What color should we paint my room?" Emma asked one evening, sitting cross-legged in what would eventually be her bedroom on the second floor. The walls were still bare studs, but she could see it. Jake knew she could see it the same way he did. "What color do you want?" Jake asked, marking measurements for electrical outlets. Emma thought for a moment, her face serious. "Something happy, not pink like a little kid, but not dark and depressing either. Maybe yellow, like sunshine?" Jake smiled. "Yellow sounds perfect, like Mom's favorite flowers." "Sunflowers," Emma said softly. "Yeah, like that." These moments, these small, ordinary moments of planning and hoping, were healing something in both of them that doctors and therapists hadn't been able to touch. The house was giving them something to build together, something that wasn't soaked in grief and loss. Every wall they finished, every room they restored, felt like a small victory over the chaos that had torn their family apart. But not everyone saw it that way. The mockery from the town hadn't faded with Jake's visible progress. If anything, it had intensified. The more work Jake completed, the more people seemed determined to predict his failure. At Murphy's Diner, the breakfast crowd had made Jake's project their primary source of entertainment. Tommy from down the street held court most mornings, regaling whoever would listen with updates delivered in a tone of amused condescension. "Saw Turner carrying lumber into that death trap yesterday," he'd say, loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear. "His leg was barely holding him up, but sure, let's rebuild a whole house. That'll end well." "I give it till spring," Rick from the hardware store would chime in. "First major storm, that roof's coming down. All that work for nothing." "Waste of disability money, if you ask me," Sandra from the corner store would add, shaking her head with exaggerated concern. "That man needs professional help, not a construction project." The women from the church prayer circle had evolved from praying for Jake's guidance to praying for Emma's safety. "Someone should check on that little girl," they'd say over coffee and Danish after Sunday service. "Making her work on that dangerous property. It's not right." Even the town council had gotten involved. At their monthly meeting, Councilman Harper had raised concerns about the Ashford property and whether Jake's renovations were up to code and safe for residential use. Never mind that Jake was documenting everything, getting the proper permits, doing the work better than most licensed contractors would have bothered to. Jake heard every word. In a town this small, gossip traveled faster than the internet. Emma heard it too. Classmates whose parents talked too freely at dinner would repeat the comments at school, sometimes with sympathy, sometimes with cruelty. More than once, Emma had come home with red eyes and tight lips, trying to hide that someone had said something mean about her dad or their house. But each time, instead of letting the mockery break her, Emma would change into her work clothes and grab her tools with renewed determination. She'd learned from her father that the best response to doubt was simply to keep working, to let results speak louder than words. "They're wrong about you," Emma told Jake one afternoon, her voice fierce as she helped him install a new support beam in the basement. "They're wrong about the house, too." "I know, baby," Jake said quietly. "But we're not doing this to prove them wrong. We're doing this because it's worth doing." Still, the constant negativity wore on him. There were nights when Jake lay awake in their cramped apartment, his leg throbbing despite the medication, wondering if everyone was right, if he was being foolish, if he was wasting money and time and energy on something that would never be finished, never be whole, never be worth the pain he was pouring into it. But then morning would come, and he'd drive to the house, and he'd see the progress they'd made. The rooms that were clean and bright, the systems that worked, the structure that was, day by day, becoming sound again. And he'd pick up his tools and keep going. It was during the fourth week of work that Jake started noticing things that didn't make sense. He was working in the East Wing, a section of the house that had clearly been added during the 1947 renovations Walter Ashford had undertaken. The walls here were different from the rest of the house. Newer construction, but oddly configured. The hallway seemed too narrow. The rooms felt cramped despite being marked as spacious on the blueprints. Jake stood in what the plans labeled as a morning room, tape measure in hand, and frowned. According to the blueprints, this room should be 14 feet by 16 feet, but when he measured it, he got 12 feet by 14 feet, 2 feet shorter in each direction. He checked his measurement 3 times, thinking he'd made a mistake. But no, the room was definitely smaller than the plans indicated. At first, Jake assumed the blueprints were just inaccurate. It wouldn't be the first time plans didn't perfectly match reality, especially in older homes where renovations happened over decades. But then he measured the adjacent room and found the same discrepancy. And the next room. Every single space in the east wing was smaller than the blueprints showed, which meant the space was going somewhere else. Jake pulled out the full set of plans and spread them across the dusty floor, weighing down the corners with tools. He traced the exterior walls of the east wing, then the interior rooms, trying to account for every square foot. The house's exterior measured 60 feet on this side, but when he added up all the interior room measurements plus wall thickness, he only got 54 feet. 6 feet of space had vanished. His engineer's brain immediately started calculating possibilities. Unusually thick walls? Possible, but unlikely. The construction was standard framing, not double thick. Hidden closets or storage? He'd opened every visible closet and found nothing unusual. Measurement error? Not across multiple rooms with multiple checks. That left only one logical explanation. There was space behind the walls that wasn't accounted for in the layout. Space that had been deliberately hidden. Jake sat back on his heels, his heart rate picking up. He thought about Walter Ashford, the mysterious owner who'd lived here alone for 50 years. The man everyone said had gone crazy, sealing up rooms and talking to ghosts. The man who'd walked into the woods one day and never returned. What if he hadn't been crazy? What if he'd been hiding something? Jake spent the next 2 days doing nothing but measuring. He mapped every room in the house, compared his measurements to the blueprints, and documented every discrepancy. What he found made his skin prickle with a mixture of excitement and unease. The east wing wasn't the only section with missing space. There were smaller discrepancies throughout the house, a few inches here, a foot there, but they all pointed back to one central area. The wall between the main parlor and what the blueprints showed as a storage room. Except Jake had never found a storage room. The blueprints showed a door that should be in the parlor's east wall, but in reality there was no door, just solid wall covered in the same plaster and wallpaper as the rest of the room. Emma found him that afternoon, sitting cross-legged on the parlor floor, surrounded by blueprints and measurement notes, staring at the wall with an intensity that made her nervous. "Dad, you okay?" Jake looked up, realizing he'd been so focused he hadn't heard her come in. "Emma, come here. I need to show you something." She set down her backpack and joined him on the floor. Jake pointed to the blueprints. "See this? This shows a storage room right here behind this wall with a door, but there's no door." "Maybe they closed it off," Emma suggested. "Maybe, but look at these measurements." He showed her his notes, the careful calculations. "This parlor should be 22 feet wide, but it's only 18 feet. 4 feet are missing." Emma's eyes widened. "Missing? Where did they go?" "That's the question." Jake stood carefully, his leg protesting the sudden movement, and approached the wall. He knocked on it with his knuckles, a solid sound, no hollow echo. This isn't just a closed-off door. This is a completely sealed wall, and behind it there's 4 feet of space that shouldn't exist according to the current layout, but does exist according to the original plans. He pulled out his flashlight and examined the wall more closely. The plaster here was slightly different from the surrounding walls, same texture and color but applied in a different pattern. Someone had done a very good job of making it look original, but Jake's trained eye could see the subtle differences. "Someone bricked something up," he said quietly, "then covered it with plaster and wallpaper to hide what they'd done." Why would they do that? Emma asked, her voice dropping to a whisper as if they might be overheard. I don't know, but I intend to find out. That evening, after Emma had gone home with Tyler's wife for dinner, Jake stayed late at the house. He couldn't stop thinking about the sealed wall, couldn't stop running calculations in his head. The military engineer in him, the part that had spent years analyzing structures, looking for hidden dangers, finding what was deliberately concealed, was fully engaged now. He set up his work lights to illuminate the parlor wall and began examining every inch of it. He tapped methodically, listening for changes in density, hollow spaces, anything that would give him a clue about what lay behind. He used his stud finder to map the framing, discovering that the studs were closer together here than standard, 16 inches on center instead of the usual 24. Stronger support, as if bearing more weight. Then, near the baseboard, his fingers found something. A seam, barely visible, covered by layers of paint and wallpaper, but definitely a seam. He traced it upward, found another running perpendicular. A rectangular outline, roughly 3 feet by 6 feet. A doorway. Sealed and hidden, but unmistakably a doorway. Jake's pulse hammered in his ears. Every instinct honed by years of searching for hidden explosives and secret weapons caches was screaming at him that this was important, that whatever was behind this wall had been sealed deliberately, carefully, by someone who didn't want it found. He grabbed his pry bar and positioned it at the edge of the seam near the baseboard. Then he hesitated. Once he did this, there was no going back. He'd be committed to following this mystery wherever it led. But wasn't that why he'd bought this house in the first place? Not just to restore it, but to prove that hidden beauty could be uncovered, that secrets could be revealed, that broken things could tell their stories if someone was patient enough to listen? Jake wedged the pry bar into the seam and pulled. The plaster cracked, a sound like ice breaking on a frozen lake. He worked the bar deeper, pulled harder. Chunks of plaster fell away, revealing wooden lathe underneath. He kept going, creating a hole large enough to shine his flashlight through. Behind the plaster was brick. Old brick, carefully laid, mortared with professional precision. Someone hadn't just sealed this doorway. They'd built a wall to ensure it stayed sealed. Jake stepped back, breathing hard, his mind racing. This wasn't normal renovation. This wasn't just closing off an unused room. This was fortification. This was someone making absolutely certain that whatever was behind this wall stayed hidden. The question was, what were they hiding? And more importantly, why? What happens next will turn this restoration upside down, reveal a truth that will shock the entire nation, and prove why sometimes the quietest voices from the past carry the most important messages. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Jake spent that night in the house, unable to leave, unable to stop staring at the brick wall he'd exposed. He'd texted Tyler to keep Emma overnight, told him he was working late and didn't want to disturb her school night routine. In reality, he couldn't tear himself away from the mystery he'd uncovered. He sat on the dusty parlor floor, his damaged legs stretched out in front of him, and studied that wall like it was an enemy position he needed to understand before approaching. The bricks were old but not original to the house, probably added during the 1947 renovations. The mortar was neat, professional work. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. Jake thought about Walter Ashford, trying to piece together what he knew from town gossip and the sparse historical records Linda had provided. Ashford had been wealthy, something to do with banking or investments. The stories varied. He'd lived in this house alone from 1947 until his disappearance in 1998. 51 years. Never married, rarely seen in town. Increasingly reclusive as he aged, the town had written him off as eccentric at best, insane at worst. But what if there was more to the story? What if the crazy behavior, the sealed rooms, the strange renovations, the isolation, had all been in service of protecting something, hiding something? Jake's military experience had taught him that people only fortified things worth protecting. You didn't build walls around nothing. You didn't seal doorways unless you desperately needed whatever was behind them to stay hidden. He pulled out his phone and did something he probably should have done weeks ago. He researched Walter Ashford. Most of what he found was local obituary information, property records, and the usual small-town historical society mentions. But then he found something interesting. A single reference in a 1948 article from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette about art recovered from Europe after World War II. The article mentioned Walter Ashford as a civilian specialist who'd worked with the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program, the group tasked with protecting cultural treasures during and after the war. He'd been in Europe from 1945 to 1947, helping to recover stolen artwork and cultural artifacts from Nazi hiding places. Jake read the short paragraph 3 times, his mind working through the implications. Ashford had been involved with recovering stolen art. Then he'd come back to Millbrook in 1947 and immediately undertaken major renovations to this house, including sealing off sections of it. It could be a coincidence, but Jake's military training had taught him not to believe in coincidences. When two unusual things lined up, there was usually a connection. He stood and approached the brick wall again, running his hands over the surface. "What did you bring back with you, Walter?" he murmured. "What were you protecting?" The next morning, Jake arrived at the house before dawn, his mind still churning with possibilities. He'd barely slept, his dreams full of sealed rooms and hidden treasures, and an old man walking into the woods to keep his secrets forever. Emma showed up after school to find him in the basement, examining the foundation walls with an intensity that bordered on obsession. "Dad, you look terrible," she said, setting down her backpack. "Did you sleep at all?" "Not much," Jake admitted. "I think I found something, Emma. Something important." He showed her what he'd discovered, how the parlor wall alignment suggested there was space behind it, how the brick fortification indicated deliberate concealment, how Walter Ashford's connection to art recovery might explain why someone would seal off part of their own house. Emma listened with wide eyes, then said the thing Jake had been thinking but hadn't wanted to voice. "You think there's something valuable hidden in this house?" "I think it's possible," Jake said carefully. "But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. It could be nothing. It could be that Ashford was paranoid and sealed off sections of the house for reasons that made sense only to him." "But you don't think so?" "No," Jake admitted. "I don't think so." They spent the rest of the afternoon examining the basement, looking for any access point to the space that Jake's measurements suggested existed above. The basement layout was simpler than the floors above, just stone foundation walls and a dirt floor in some sections, concrete in others. But here, too, the dimensions didn't quite match up. Jake found it near the northeast corner, a section of the stone wall that looked identical to the rest but felt different when he pressed against it. The mortar was slightly softer, slightly newer. He tapped it with his knuckles and got a different sound, not quite hollow but not quite solid either. "Hand me the pry bar," he said to Emma, his voice tight with anticipation. She passed it to him, and Jake wedged it into the mortar line between two large foundation stones. He applied pressure carefully. He didn't want to destabilize the foundation. The mortar crumbled more easily than it should have, and suddenly one of the stones shifted inward. Not a stone, a facade. Concrete shaped and painted to look like stone fitted perfectly into place. Behind it was a steel door. Jake and Emma stared at it in stunned silence. The door was old but well-maintained, heavy-gauge steel with a commercial lock mechanism. This wasn't something a homeowner installed for a storage closet. This was serious security. "Oh my God," Emma whispered. "Dad, what is this?" Jake's hands trembled as he examined the door. His military training catalogued details automatically. Industrial hinges, reinforced frame, a lock that would require either the key or serious cutting tools to breach. This door was designed to keep people out or to keep something valuable in. "I don't know," Jake said honestly. "But whatever's behind this door, Walter Ashford wanted to make absolutely sure it stayed protected. He tried the handle, not expecting it to turn. It didn't. The lock was engaged, and without the key, they weren't getting through this way. But Jake's engineer mind was already working. If this door was in the basement, it probably led to a sealed room or vault, which meant there had to be ventilation. You couldn't seal off a space completely, or moisture and mold would destroy whatever was inside, which meant there had to be another access point, probably above. He looked up at the ceiling joists, tracing the layout in his mind. The parlor was directly above them. The sealed brick wall in the parlor would be right there, above this door.
"We need to go upstairs,"
Jake said. In the parlor, Jake approached the brick wall with new determination. Now he wasn't just curious. He was certain. Behind this brick was a space that connected to the steel door in the basement. A sealed room that Walter Ashford had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide and protect. The question was, did Jake have the right to open it? This wasn't his secret. This was Ashford's. Maybe there were good reasons it had been sealed. Maybe there were legal implications. Maybe opening it would unleash something Ashford had been right to hide. But Jake thought about the house, about how everyone had called it cursed and worthless, about how he'd been mocked for seeing value in something everyone else had given up on, about how sometimes the things we hide are the things that most need to be brought into the light. He picked up his sledgehammer. "Dad," Emma said nervously, "are you sure about this?" Jake looked at his daughter, this brave girl who'd helped him tear down walls both literal and metaphorical, who'd believed in this project when everyone else called it folly. "No," he admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway, because I need to know. Because Walter Ashford kept this secret for 50 years, and now it's passed to us, and I think maybe he wanted someone to eventually find it. Why else leave the house standing? Why else maintain it as long as he could before his mind failed him?" Emma nodded slowly. "Okay, but I'm staying with you. We're doing this together." "Together," Jake agreed. He swung the sledgehammer. The impact sent shockwaves up his arms and down his damaged leg, but the brick cracked. He swung again and again. Each impact opened the wall a little more, revealing darkness beyond, revealing a secret that had been waiting 7 decades to be discovered. After 20 minutes of steady work, Jake had created a hole large enough to shine his flashlight through. He clicked it on and aimed the beam into the darkness beyond the brick. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. It wasn't a storage room. It wasn't a closet. It was a vault. A proper, purpose-built vault with reinforced walls and climate control systems. And lining those walls, wrapped in protective cloth and carefully stored on wooden shelving, were paintings, dozens of them, maybe more. "Emma," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper, "go get Tyler. Tell him to come right now, and tell him to bring his camera." "What is it? What do you see?" Jake pulled back from the hole, his mind reeling, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He looked at his daughter, this child who'd lost her mother and watched her father struggle and still believed that broken things could be fixed, that cursed houses could be redeemed, that faith could move mountains. "I think," he said slowly, "I think we just found out why everyone thought this house was cursed. And I think Walter Ashford wasn't crazy at all. I think he was protecting something that the world thought was lost forever." Tyler arrived within 20 minutes, his work boots pounding up the porch steps, camera bag slung over his shoulder. He found Jake and Emma sitting in the parlor, both of them staring at the hole in the brick wall like it might vanish if they looked away. "What's going on?" Tyler demanded, slightly out of breath. "Emma said it was urgent, that you'd found something." He stopped mid-sentence when he saw the demolished brick wall, the darkness beyond, the look on Jake's face. "What the hell did you find?" "I don't know yet," Jake said, standing carefully. "Not exactly. But Tyler, I need you to document everything. Take photos of the wall before we go further. Photos of whatever's inside. Time-stamped, dated, everything. I need a record that we didn't disturb anything, that we documented the discovery properly. Tyler's expression shifted from confusion to understanding. He'd served with Jake long enough to recognize when his friend had stumbled into something serious. You think there's something valuable in there? I know there is, Jake said quietly. I saw paintings, a lot of paintings, professional storage, climate control. This isn't a homeowner hiding some family heirlooms. This is a vault. Tyler whistled low and pulled out his camera. He spent 15 minutes photographing the parlor from every angle, documenting the hole in the wall, the exposed brick, the tools Jake had used. He was methodical and thorough, good training from their army days when documentation could mean the difference between a commendation and a court-martial. Okay, Tyler finally said, I've got the before. Now let's see what we're dealing with. Jake picked up his sledgehammer again, his hands trembling slightly despite his best efforts to stay calm. He widened the hole, working carefully now, treating the brick wall like the archaeological artifact it had become. Each brick he removed was set aside carefully, numbered with chalk. Emma handed him tools, her own hands shaking with a mixture of fear and excitement. After another 30 minutes of careful demolition, they'd created an opening large enough for a person to step through. Jake played his flashlight beam through the gap, illuminating more of the space beyond. It was roughly 10 feet square, with walls that had been reinforced with concrete and lined with some kind of moisture barrier. Modern climate control equipment hummed softly in one corner. Someone, probably Walter Ashford, had maintained this system for decades. The temperature inside felt cool but not cold, dry but not desiccated, perfect conditions for preserving delicate materials. And everywhere, on shelves, on easels, carefully wrapped and stored, were paintings. I'm going in, Jake said, handing the flashlight to Tyler. Keep that light steady. He stepped through the opening carefully, his damaged leg making the awkward climb through the gap more difficult than it should have been. But then he was inside, standing in a room that had been sealed since 1947, breathing air that smelled of old canvas and linseed oil and secrets kept for 70 years. Tyler passed the flashlight back through, then his work light. Jake set them up to illuminate the space, and as the light spread through the vault, he felt his knees go weak. The paintings weren't just old, they were magnificent. Even wrapped in protective cloth, even covered with decades of dust, Jake could see the quality of the frames, the care with which they'd been stored. Each piece had a small brass plaque beside it, carefully engraved with details he couldn't quite read in the dim light. With shaking hands, Jake approached the nearest painting. It was roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, wrapped in what looked like archival cloth. He hesitated, suddenly terrified to touch it, to disturb something that had been protected for so long.
Jake!
Tyler called from outside the wall.
What do you see?
I see. Jake's voice failed him. He swallowed hard and tried again. I see about 30 paintings, maybe more, all stored professionally, all labeled. He carefully, so carefully, pulled back the cloth covering the nearest painting. The fabric fell away to reveal a landscape, rolling hills rendered in bold, swirling brushstrokes, vibrant blues and yellows and greens that seemed to move even in the still light, a windmill in the distance, wheat fields bending under an invisible wind, and in the lower right corner, a signature, Vincent. Jake's hands began to shake so badly he had to set the cloth down. "Oh my God," he whispered. "What?" Emma's voice, high and worried, came from the opening. "Dad, what is it?" "It's a Van Gogh," Jake said, his voice barely audible. "It's a Vincent van Gogh, an original." Silence from the other side of the wall. Then Tyler's voice, carefully controlled. "Jake, man, are you sure? Could it be a reproduction? A really good forgery?" Jake studied the painting more closely, his flashlight beam illuminating the thick impasto, the characteristic brushwork, the way the paint had been applied with almost violent energy. He'd seen reproductions of Van Gogh's work, everyone had, but this was different. This had depth, texture, a kind of luminous quality that no print could capture. "I'm not an expert," Jake said. "But Tyler, this looks real. This looks very, very real." He moved to the next painting, unable to stop himself now, compelled to see what else was hidden in this impossible room. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a water scene, a Japanese bridge over a lily pond rendered in soft blues and greens and purples. The brushwork was looser, more impressionistic, but no less masterful, signed Claude Monet. "Monet," Jake said, louder now. "There's a Monet." He moved faster now, unwrapping painting after painting, each one more impossible than the last. A portrait in Rembrandt's style, dark, dramatic, the subject's face emerging from shadow like a ghost. A ballet scene by Degas, dancers captured mid-movement, a still life that might have been a Cézanne, a landscape that could only be a Constable. Jake's mind reeled. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. You didn't find rooms full of masterworks hidden in abandoned houses in small Pennsylvania towns. Things like this didn't happen to injured veterans who bought cursed properties on a desperate gamble, but the evidence was literally in his hands. "Tyler," Jake called, his voice strange even to his own ears. "I need you to get in here. I need someone else to see this. I need to know I'm not hallucinating." Tyler climbed through the opening, followed by Emma despite Jake's half-hearted protest that she should stay back. They stood together in the vault, the three of them, staring at the revealed paintings in stunned silence. "Holy shit," Tyler finally whispered. "Jake, these can't be real. Can they?"
I don't know, Jake admitted, but if they are forgeries, they're the best I've ever seen. And why would someone seal forgeries in a vault with professional climate control for 70 years?
Emma moved to a painting Jake hadn't yet uncovered, a medium-sized canvas wrapped in blue cloth. "Can I?" she asked. Jake nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Emma carefully pulled back the cloth, revealing a portrait of a young woman in 17th-century dress. The technique was unmistakable. Luminous flesh tones, intricate detail, the subject's eyes seeming to follow you wherever you moved. A small plaque beside it read, "Girl with Pearl Necklace, Johannes Vermeer, circa 1665. "Dad," Emma whispered, "I learned about Vermeer in art class. There are only like 34 of his paintings in the whole world. They're worth millions, each." Jake felt the room tilt slightly, his damaged leg suddenly unable to support his weight. He sat down hard on the concrete floor, heedless of the dust. His mind was trying to process the magnitude of what they'd found, but it was too big, too impossible. Tyler was methodically photographing everything now, his training overriding his shock. He documented each painting, each label, the storage conditions, the climate control equipment. "We need to secure this site," he said. "Right now, before we do anything else. And Jake, man, you need to call someone. The police, the FBI, art experts, someone official who can handle this." But Jake couldn't move yet. His eyes had found something else in the corner of the vault. A desk, old and solid, with a leather chair pulled up to it. On the desk's surface sat a metal filing cabinet and what looked like a ledger bound in leather. He stood carefully and moved to the desk, brushing dust from the ledger's cover. Embossed on the front in faded gold letters, "Collection Record, Walter P. Ashford, 1947. With trembling hands, Jake opened it. The first page was a title sheet, written in careful, precise handwriting. "To whoever finds this. If you are reading these words, then I am gone, and my secret has outlived me. I have no family to pass this burden to, no heirs to entrust with the truth. So I entrust it to chance, to fate, to whoever is brave or foolish enough to dig deeper than the surface. What you have found here is not treasure, though the world will call it that. It is memory. It is testimony.
It is art that survived when the artists, the collectors, the families who loved these works did not. I did not steal these paintings. I saved them. And now, whoever you are, that burden passes to you. I pray you are wiser than I was. I pray you have the courage I lacked to return them to the light. Walter P. Ashford, May 1997. Jake read the words 3 times, his throat tight. Walter Ashford hadn't been crazy. He hadn't been a thief. He'd been a guardian of something he didn't know how to give back. He turned the page and found a detailed inventory. 36 paintings in total, each one listed with meticulous care. Title, artist, approximate date, dimensions, condition notes, and most importantly, provenance. Jake began reading the entries, and with each one the story became clearer and more heartbreaking. Landscape with Windmill, Vincent van Gogh, 1889. Recovered from Hermann Göring's collection at Carenhall, May 1945. Original owner, Rothschild family, Paris. Family murdered at Auschwitz, 1943. No surviving heirs located as of 1947. Water Lilies and Japanese Bridge, Claude Monet, 1899. Recovered from Alt-Aussee salt mine, Austria, April 1945. Original owner, Samuel Morgenstern, Amsterdam. Killed during deportation, 1942. Wife and 3 children also killed, no surviving family members. Portrait of a Man in Black, Rembrandt van Rijn, 1632. Recovered from Neuschwanstein Castle, June 1945. Original owner, National Museum of Warsaw, stolen 1939. Museum destroyed during Warsaw Uprising, 1944. Polish government unable to provide secure storage as of 1947. On and on it went. Every painting had a story of loss. Every piece of art represented a family destroyed, a life extinguished, a future that never came to be. The Holocaust wasn't just history in these pages, it was personal, specific, documented in careful detail. Jake felt tears burning his eyes. He'd found treasure, yes, millions of dollars worth of art, maybe hundreds of millions, but he'd also found a memorial, a testament to lives stolen and beauty nearly lost forever. He looked up to find Tyler and Emma reading over his shoulder, both of them silent, both understanding the weight of what they'd discovered. "Dad," Emma said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "What happened? Why are these here? Why didn't Mr. Ashford give them back?" Jake turned more pages, finding Walter Ashford's explanation written in entries that grew increasingly desperate over the years. The story that emerged was both heroic and tragic. Walter Ashford had indeed worked with the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives program. The Monuments men who'd raced across Europe trying to save cultural treasures from Nazi looting and wartime destruction. He'd been one of the civilian specialists brought in because of his expertise in art authentication and preservation. From 1945 to 1947, he'd helped recover thousands of pieces of stolen art from salt mines, castles, bunkers, and private collections that had belonged to high-ranking Nazis. Most of it had been successfully returned to museums, governments, and surviving family members. But some pieces, like the ones in this vault, had fallen into a bureaucratic nightmare. Their original owners were dead, entire families wiped out. The museums that had housed them were destroyed. The governments that might have claimed them were in chaos or no longer existed. The Allied Art Commission, overwhelmed with thousands of claims and limited resources, had placed these unresolvable pieces in storage facilities, while lawyers and officials argued about their proper disposition. And Walter Ashford, watching these masterworks sit in crates in government warehouses, had seen them damaged by poor storage conditions, nearly sold at auction to private collectors, almost lost to bureaucratic indifference. So he'd done something desperate. He'd taken them, not for profit. The ledger made that clear. Ashford had never sold a single piece, never borrowed against them, never treated them as personal property.
He'd simply removed them from a system that was failing to protect them and brought them to a place where he could ensure their survival. He'd built this vault, installed climate control, maintained them with museum-quality care, and waited for a time when the world would be ready to handle them properly. But that time never came. The Cold War made international cooperation difficult. The art market became increasingly commercial and corrupt, and Ashford, growing older and more isolated, became afraid that revealing the collection would lead to exactly what he'd feared, the paintings being tied up in legal battles for decades, or worse, falling into the hands of wealthy collectors who'd hide them away in private vaults. So he kept his secret, and the secret kept him prisoner in this house, unable to leave, unable to trust anyone, slowly losing his mind to the burden of what he protected. The final entries in the ledger, dated 1997, showed a man who knew his mental faculties were failing. "I can no longer remember some days. The doctor says it is Alzheimer's. I have perhaps a year before I forget why I must stay here, why I must protect this room. I have sealed the vault as best I can. The climate control will run as long as the house has power. The paintings will survive longer than I will. To whoever finds this, I beg you, do not let them be lost again. Do not let lawyers and governments argue over them while they sit in darkness. Give them back to the world. Let them be seen, studied, loved. That is what art is for. I have been their guardian for 50 years. Now you must be." Jake closed the ledger and sat in silence, the weight of Walter Ashford's plea settling over him like a physical thing. He'd come to this house looking for a project, for something to fix, for a way to prove that broken things could be made whole. Instead, he'd found a responsibility that stretched across decades and continents, that connected to one of history's greatest atrocities, that would change everything about his life and his daughter's future. "What are we going to do?" Emma asked quietly. Jake looked at the paintings surrounding them, these beautiful, tragic survivors of hatred and violence, preserved by one man's desperate choice. He thought about the families who'd owned them, who'd loved them, who'd been murdered for the crime of existing. He thought about Walter Ashford, driven to isolation and eventual madness by the weight of his secret. And he thought about himself, a broken veteran who'd bought a cursed house because he needed to believe that restoration was possible, that things given up for lost could still be saved. "We're going to do what Walter asked," Jake said firmly. "We're going to bring them back to the light, all of them. We're going to find out where they belong and make sure they get there. Not for the money, not for fame, but because it's the right thing to do." Tyler nodded slowly. "That's going to be complicated. Really complicated. There are going to be legal issues, ownership claims, governments involved." "I know," Jake said. "But we can't just seal this room back up and pretend we didn't find it. We can't let Walter's 50 years of guardianship be for nothing." Emma moved to stand beside her father, looking up at him with an expression that mixed pride with worry. "People are going to say things, aren't they? Bad things. About you. About us." Jake put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "Yeah, baby. They probably will. Some people will say I should keep them, sell them, get rich. Others will say I should have left them alone. But we know the truth. We know why Walter hid them and why we have to reveal them." He looked around the vault one more time, at the paintings that represented so much loss and so much hope, at the impossible responsibility that had just landed in his lap. "Tyler," he said, "call your wife. Tell her Emma's staying with you tonight. Then help me secure this room. We need to seal it back up temporarily, keep it climate controlled, make sure nothing gets disturbed. Tomorrow I'll call—" He paused, trying to figure out who you even contacted about something like this. "I'll call the FBI, I guess, their art crime division, and probably some museums, art historians. This is too big for us to handle alone." They spent the next 3 hours carefully documenting everything, taking hundreds of photographs, securing the vault. Jake didn't rewrap the paintings they'd uncovered. Experts would need to see them to authenticate, but he made sure nothing would be disturbed before official help arrived. Finally, exhausted and overwhelmed, they climbed back through the hole in the wall. Jake looked at his watch. 11:30 at night. They'd been in that vault for over 6 hours, and it felt like 6 minutes. Emma had fallen asleep on the parlor floor, wrapped in Tyler's jacket. Tyler himself sat with his back against the wall, camera still in his hands, looking shell-shocked. "You realize this is going to change everything, right?" Tyler said quietly. "Your life, Emma's life, this whole town. Once word gets out—" "I know," Jake said, "but it was already changed the day I bought this house. I just didn't know how much." He carefully lifted Emma. She barely stirred, exhausted from the emotional intensity of the discovery, and carried her out to Tyler's car. His legs screamed at the additional weight, but he ignored it. Some things were more important than pain. After Tyler drove away with Emma, Jake sat alone on the porch steps in the cold November night. The house loomed behind him, no longer cursed, no longer just a restoration project. It had become something else entirely, a keeper of secrets, a guardian of memory, a bridge between a terrible past and an uncertain future. He thought about calling the authorities right then, but it was midnight and he was exhausted and he needed time to process what he'd found before he unleashed it on the world. Instead, he pulled out his phone and did something he hadn't done in months. He scrolled through his photos until he found pictures of Sarah, his wife, Emma's mother, the woman who'd loved old houses and believed in restoration and had made him promise, in one of their last conversations before the accident, that he'd never stop believing in beauty. "I found it, Sarah," he whispered to her image on the screen. "I found the beauty hidden in the broken place, and it's so much bigger than I ever imagined." The wind picked up, rustling through the old oak trees that surrounded the property. In the darkness, with just the porch light creating a small pool of illumination, Jake felt connected to something larger than himself, to Walter Ashford, who'd sacrificed his sanity to protect beauty, to the families who'd owned these paintings before hate destroyed them, to every person who'd ever believed that art mattered, that memory mattered, that bearing witness to history was worth any cost. He'd come to Millbrook a broken man, mocked for his foolish investment in a cursed house. He'd endured ridicule, doubt, pain. He'd worked until his body screamed and his hands bled. He'd torn down walls looking for beauty he believed must exist underneath the rot and ruin. And he'd found it. Oh God, he'd found it. But finding it was just the beginning. Now came the harder part, figuring out what to do with 36 masterworks worth of fortune, each one carrying the weight of tragedy and the responsibility of testimony. Now came the lawyers, the experts, the governments, the media attention, the questions about his motives and his rights and his plans. Now came the part where Jake Turner, the veteran everyone pitied and the fool everyone mocked, would have to stand before the world and explain why some treasures are too important to keep, why some secrets must be revealed even at great personal cost, why doing the right thing matters more than any amount of money. He was terrified. But he was also ready, because if 3 years of pain and loss had taught him anything, it was that you couldn't heal by hiding. You couldn't move forward by sealing away the difficult truths. You had to face them, acknowledge them, and choose every single day to believe that light was stronger than darkness. Jake stood carefully, his leg protesting the movement, and walked back into the house. He moved through the rooms they'd restored. The dining room with its recovered tin ceiling, the kitchen with its salvaged cabinetry, the hallway with its refinished floors. Each space represented hours of work, days of determination, weeks of refusing to give up. And now, behind a brick wall he'd demolished, was a space that represented something even more important. The determination of families to create beauty, of soldiers to preserve it, of one man to protect it, and now of Jake and Emma to ensure it survived. He stopped in front of the hole in the parlor wall, the opening that led to the vault and its impossible contents. Tomorrow he'd call the FBI. Tomorrow he'd start the process that would bring these paintings back to the world. Tomorrow everything would change. But tonight, he simply stood guard over the secret Walter Ashford had kept for 50 years. The burden that had now passed to him. The treasure that would prove once and for all that sometimes the most cursed places hold the most sacred truths. "I'll finish what you started, Walter," Jake said quietly to the darkness. "I promise you that. These paintings will see the light again. They'll be studied, preserved, loved. I'll make sure of it." The house seemed to settle around him, the old timbers creaking softly, as if acknowledging his oath. Jake checked the temporary barriers they'd erected to secure the vault, made sure the climate control was still running, then locked the house and drove back to the apartment where Emma would be sleeping peacefully at Tyler's place. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table with Walter Ashford's ledger. He'd taken it, would return it to the vault, but needed to read every word, and learned the story of each painting, each family, each loss. He memorized names. He traced provenances. He understood, in a way he never had before, that the Holocaust wasn't just a number, 6 million Jews, millions of others, but a collection of individual lives, individual families, individual futures stolen. And now, hidden in a house in Pennsylvania for 70 years, was proof of 36 of those stolen futures. Proof that beauty had existed, that families had loved it, that even in the midst of mechanized murder, people had fought to preserve it. By dawn, Jake had made his decision. He'd contacted no one yet, called no authorities, but he knew with absolute certainty what he had to do. These paintings couldn't be sold. They couldn't be kept. They couldn't become his property in any meaningful sense. They belonged to history, to memory, to the families who'd lost everything. His role, his and Emma's, was simply to be the bridge that carried them from Walter Ashford's desperate hiding place back to the world that needed to see them, to learn from them, to remember. Whatever happened after that, whether he got a finder's fee, whether museums fought over them, whether governments made claims, was secondary to the fundamental truth that these paintings had to be free. Just like he'd freed the house from neglect, he'd free these artworks from secrecy, because some things were too important to keep hidden. And Jake Turner, the mocked veteran with the cursed house and the dead wife and the impossible determination to prove that broken things could be restored, was about to give the world back something it thought was lost forever. Jake made the call at 7 in the morning, his hands steady despite having not slept, his voice calm despite the chaos he was about to unleash. "FBI Philadelphia Field Office. How may I direct your call?" "Art crime team, please," Jake said. "I need to report a discovery, a significant discovery." There was a pause, some clicking, then a new voice, female, professional, slightly skeptical in the way of people who fielded crank calls regularly. "This is Special Agent Rebecca Hartley, Art Crime Team. How can I help you?" Jake took a breath. "My name is Jake Turner. I'm a veteran living in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. I recently purchased a house that belonged to a man named Walter Ashford, who worked with the Monuments Men program after World War II. Yesterday, I found a sealed vault in the house containing approximately 36 paintings that appear to be masterworks: Van Gogh, Monet, Rembrandt, Vermeer, others. They're accompanied by detailed provenance documentation suggesting they were recovered from Nazi collections but never returned to their rightful owners." Silence on the other end. Then, "Can you repeat that, please?" Jake did, adding more details. The vault's location, the climate control system, the leather-bound ledger with Walter Ashford's confession. He spoke calmly, factually, like he was reporting a suspicious package on a street corner, rather than announcing what might be one of the most significant art discoveries in decades. "Mr. Turner," Agent Hartley said, her voice shifting from skeptical to intensely focused, "I need you to listen very carefully. Don't touch anything else in that vault. Don't let anyone else access it. Don't take any more photographs, and for God's sake, don't post anything on social media. I'm going to assemble a team and we'll be there by early afternoon. Can you secure the location until then? The house is locked, Jake said. I'm the only one with keys. My friend helped me document the discovery. He's former Army, knows proper procedure. But we haven't disturbed anything beyond what was necessary to identify what we found. Good. That's very good. Stay by your phone. I'll call you back within the hour with more details. After she hung up, Jake sat in the silence of his cramped apartment and waited for the world to change. Agent Hartley arrived at 2 in the afternoon with a convoy that transformed the quiet street in front of the Ashford house into something resembling a federal operation. 3 black SUVs, a panel van with equipment, and, most impressively, a curator from the Philadelphia Museum of Art and a conservator from the Smithsonian who'd been helicoptered in from Washington. Jake met them at the door, his limp more pronounced than usual after a sleepless night and the stress of waiting. Agent Hartley was exactly what her voice had suggested, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of professional demeanor that suggested she'd seen everything and was rarely impressed. Until Jake led them to the vault. He'd temporarily removed enough brick to create a proper entrance, and the team filed through one by one. Hartley, the curator, a distinguished man named Dr. Anton Kowalski, the conservator, a quiet woman named Patricia Chen, and 3 other FBI agents carrying cameras and documentation equipment. The silence when they first saw the paintings was absolute. Dr. Kowalski approached the unwrapped Van Gogh with his hands literally trembling, pulling out a jeweler's loupe and a small UV light from his bag. He studied the canvas for what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 minutes, examining brushwork, checking the craquelure pattern of the aged paint, testing the canvas edges. "Mother of God," he whispered finally. "If this is a forgery, it's the most sophisticated I've ever encountered. The brushwork is consistent with Van Gogh's Arles period. The pigments appear correct for the 1880s. The aging patterns are right. The canvas is period appropriate." He looked up, his face pale. "Pending laboratory analysis, I believe this is authentic." They moved through the vault methodically, examining painting after painting. Each authentication took time, careful study, documentation, preliminary testing. Dr. Kowalski and Patricia Chen worked in intense silence, occasionally murmuring technical observations to each other, while Agent Hartley and her team photographed everything and Jake stood to the side, feeling both essential and superfluous. The Monet made Dr. Kowalski weep. Actually weep. "This piece was in the Morgenstern collection in Amsterdam," he said, his voice breaking. "It was presumed destroyed when the family was deported. We have photographs of it from before the war, but no one thought it survived." The Vermeer made Patricia Chen sit down hard on the floor. "There are only 34 known Vermeer paintings in the entire world," she said, staring at the portrait. 34. "If this is authentic, and preliminary examination suggests it is, this is monumental. Absolutely monumental." They worked until midnight, examining every piece, comparing them against international databases of stolen and missing art. With each painting they authenticated, the story became clearer and more heartbreaking. "This Degas," Agent Hartley said, reading from her tablet, "stolen from a private collection in Lyon, France, 1941. The collector, Henri Beaumont, and his entire family were murdered at Drancy. No surviving relatives have ever been located. This constable, taken from a country estate in Poland during the German occupation. The family who owned it was executed in the woods behind their home. The house was burned. Everyone thought the painting was destroyed with it. This Cézanne, part of a collection seized from the Rothschild family. Most of the collection was recovered after the war, but several pieces, including this one, were listed as missing, presumed lost. By the time they finished the preliminary examination, it was 2 in the morning. Dr. Kowalski looked at Jake with an expression that mixed awe with something close to reverence. "Mr. Turner," he said quietly, "what you've found here is extraordinary. Not just in terms of monetary value. though we're certainly talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. But in terms of historical significance, these paintings represent families destroyed, futures stolen, a systematic attempt to erase culture and beauty from the world. The fact that they survived, that Walter Ashford preserved them with such care, that you found them and had the integrity to report them immediately. His voice broke. This is the kind of discovery that happens maybe once in a generation, maybe once in a lifetime. Jake didn't know what to say to that. He just nodded, exhausted and overwhelmed. Agent Hartley pulled him aside as her team began the process of securing the vault for long-term evidence preservation. "We're going to need to take control of the site for now," she said. "This is officially a federal investigation. We'll have agents here 24/7 until we can properly relocate the collection to a secure facility for full authentication and conservation." "I understand," Jake said. "What happens to me? To my house?" "You'll get it back once we've completed our work. As for the legal situation," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "this is complicated. The paintings were technically on your property, which you own legally, but they're also stolen property, even if stolen by someone trying to protect them. There are international laws, treaties, competing claims. This is going to take years to sort out." "I don't want to keep them," Jake said firmly. "That's not why I reported this. They need to go back where they belong, to museums, to families, if any can be found, to the world. Walter Ashford protected them because he was afraid of what would happen if he revealed them. But I think the world is ready now. I think we can do better now." Hartley studied him for a long moment. "You're an unusual man, Mr. Turner. Most people who find something worth this much would at least consider keeping it." "I'm not most people," Jake said quietly. "I'm a veteran who knows what it's like to lose everything. These paintings belong to people who lost more than I can imagine. I'm not going to profit from their tragedy." The next morning the media arrived. Jake had no idea how word got out so fast. Maybe one of the FBI agents had a friend who had a friend. Maybe someone in town saw the federal convoy and started asking questions. Maybe it was just the way information leaked in the modern world. But by 9 a.m., there were news vans parked on the street, reporters setting up cameras, helicopters circling overhead. The FBI tried to control the narrative, issuing a brief statement confirming that a significant discovery of artworks believed stolen during World War II had been made in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. But that only intensified the feeding frenzy. Jake's phone rang constantly. News outlets, documentary producers, book publishers, lawyers offering their services. He turned it off after the 20th call and sat on his porch, watching the circus unfold with a kind of detached disbelief. Tyler arrived mid-morning with Emma, who'd stayed overnight at his place and woke to find her father's discovery all over the news. "Dad!" She ran up the porch steps and threw her arms around him. "They're saying you found hundreds of millions of dollars. They're saying it's the biggest art discovery in 50 years. Is it true?" "Yeah, baby," Jake said, holding her tight. "It's true, but it's more complicated than that." "How complicated?" Tyler asked, settling onto the porch railing. "Very," Jake admitted. He explained about the FBI securing the site, about the authentication process, about the competing claims and international laws, and the reality that these paintings weren't his to keep even if he wanted them. "So what happens to you?" Emma asked, her voice worried. "Do you get anything?" "I don't know yet," Jake said honestly. "Maybe a finder's fee, maybe nothing, but that's not why I reported it." By afternoon, the town's reaction had shifted from confusion to shock to something approaching disbelief. The same people who'd mocked Jake for buying the cursed house now couldn't reconcile their assumptions with reality. At Murphy's Diner, the usual breakfast crowd sat in stunned silence, watching news coverage on the TV above the counter. Images of the Ashford house flashed on screen, FBI agents carrying equipment, expert conservators in white gloves, reporters breathlessly describing one of the most significant art discoveries of the 21st century. "That's Jake Turner's house," someone said unnecessarily. "The vet we've been laughing at for months," someone else added. Rick from the hardware store sat with his coffee growing cold, remembering every snide comment he'd made about Jake's money pit. Tommy from down the street kept opening and closing his mouth, unable to find words. Margaret, the librarian who'd organized prayer circles for Jake's misguided project, looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. The news coverage was relentless. By evening, every major network had picked up the story. CNN ran a segment titled "Veterans Discovery: Art Treasures Hidden for 70 Years. The New York Times sent a reporter. The BBC called from London. Museums in Paris, Amsterdam, Berlin, and Warsaw released statements expressing hope that pieces stolen from their collections might be among those found. And through it all, Jake stayed on his porch, watching federal agents guard his house, answering the occasional question from reporters who managed to get past the barriers, and trying to process the magnitude of what his stubbornness had uncovered. Father Michael showed up in the evening, climbing the porch steps with a bottle of wine and a rueful smile. "Jake," the old priest said, settling into the chair beside him, "I came to apologize." "For what?" "For doubting you. For not having more faith. I told you this was about resurrection. But I don't think even I fully believed how literal that would be." He gestured toward the house, toward the news vans, toward the ongoing circus. "You didn't just restore a building. You brought back something the world thought was lost. You proved that believing in impossible things sometimes makes them real." Jake poured them both wine into paper cups, all he had. "Father, I didn't do anything special. I just knocked down a wall because the measurements didn't make sense." "That's exactly what faith is," Father Michael said. "Knocking down walls when the world tells you to leave them alone. Looking deeper when everyone else has stopped looking. Believing that broken things hide beauty underneath." The legal process took months to unfold. Teams of lawyers, art historians, government officials, and museum directors descended on Millbrook. The paintings were carefully transported to a secure facility in Philadelphia where they underwent extensive authentication. Each piece required hundreds of hours of analysis, X-rays to examine the underlying layers, chemical testing of pigments, dendrochronology of the wooden panels, comparison against known works and historical photographs. One by one, the paintings were confirmed as authentic. The Van Gogh, genuine, painted during his most productive period in Arles, valued conservatively at $40 million. The Monet, authentic, one of his largest and most accomplished water lily paintings, estimated at $35 million. The Vermeer, real, which alone was enough to make international headlines because discovering a new Vermeer was like finding a missing Shakespeare play. Estimated value over $60 million. On and on through the collection. When the final tally came in, the total value exceeded $250 million. The ownership question was more complicated. Under U.S. law and international treaties, Jake had a legitimate claim as the property owner who'd discovered the works in good faith. But there were also claims from surviving family members of the original owners, from museums that had been robbed, from governments whose citizens had been murdered. The legal team that Jake assembled, pro bono because everyone wanted to be part of this case, worked through each painting individually, trying to find the most ethical resolution. "You could fight for full ownership," his lead attorney told him during one of their many meetings. "The law is actually on your side. These were on your property, abandoned for decades. A court would likely rule in your favor." "I don't want to fight," Jake said. "I want to do what Walter Ashford asked. Return them to where they belong." After 6 months of negotiation, a settlement was reached. 23 paintings would go to museums, some returned to institutions they'd been stolen from, others donated to major museums with the stipulation that they be displayed with explanations of their history and the families who'd owned them. 8 would be returned to surviving family members, grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the original owners, many of whom wept when they learned that something of their murdered relatives' lives had survived. 5 would be sold at auction, with proceeds going to Holocaust education programs and art preservation initiatives. And Jake, as the finder who'd reported the discovery promptly and cooperated fully, would receive a finder's fee, $25 million. When his lawyer told him the number, Jake had to sit down. He couldn't find words. That's more money than I can even comprehend. It's fair, the lawyer said. It's actually less than you could have gotten if you'd been more aggressive. But it reflects the significance of the discovery and your role in bringing these works back to the world. Jake thought about the cramped apartment where he and Emma still lived, about his nearly empty bank account, about the mounting bills from the house restoration, and his constant worry about how he'd pay for Emma's future, college, a wedding someday, all the things fathers wanted to give their daughters. $25 million would solve every financial problem he'd ever have. But Jake had learned something over the past year of restoration work. Money wasn't the same as purpose. I want to set up a trust, he told his lawyer. $10 million goes into a college fund for Emma and an investment account that'll take care of her future. I want her secure, always. $5 million goes to finish restoring the house, do it right, hire proper contractors for the work I can't do myself. And the rest I want to use to help other veterans, buy properties, train them in restoration work, give them projects and purpose the way this house gave me purpose. His lawyer smiled. That's very generous. Very unusual. It's not generosity, Jake said. It's paying forward what this house gave me. It saved my life. Maybe it can save others, too. The formal announcement of Jake's intentions came at a press conference at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where the Van Gogh would be the centerpiece of a new exhibition about recovered Nazi-looted art. Jake stood at a podium, uncomfortable in a suit Tyler had helped him buy, with Emma beside him in a dress that made her look impossibly grown up. I didn't find these paintings to get rich, Jake told the assembled reporters, his voice steady despite his nerves. I found them because I was trying to restore a house everyone said was worthless. Because I believed that underneath the rot and ruin there was something beautiful worth saving. Turns out I was more right than I ever imagined. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Walter Ashford protected these paintings for 50 years because he was afraid of what would happen if he revealed them. He thought the world would fight over them, hide them away, treat them as investments instead of testimony. But I have to believe we can do better now. I have to believe that we've learned enough from history to treat these works with the respect they deserve, not as treasures to be hoarded, but as memories to be shared. So what happens to the money? A reporter called out. Jake looked at Emma, who nodded encouragingly. I'm keeping enough to secure my daughter's future and finish restoring the house. The rest, $15 million, is going into a foundation that will buy damaged properties and train combat veterans in restoration work. We'll teach them carpentry, plumbing, electrical work, all the skills that turn broken buildings into homes. Because I learned something this year. Restoring broken things is a way of restoring yourself. The room erupted in questions, but Jake stepped back from the microphone, done with speeches, ready to return to the actual work. Back in Millbrook, the town's transformation was complete. The people who'd mocked Jake now couldn't mention him without awe in their voices. The house that had been called cursed was now a landmark, with historical designation pending. Tourists drove past to take pictures. The town council issued a formal proclamation thanking Jake for bringing international recognition to Millbrook. But the personal apologies were harder. Rick from the hardware store showed up at the house one Saturday morning, hat literally in hand. Jake, he said, unable to meet Jake's eyes. I need to say something. I was wrong. I made fun of you, called this place a money pit, told everyone you were wasting your time. I was an asshole, and I'm sorry. Jake, who was working on restoring the third-floor bedrooms, set down his paintbrush. Rick, it's okay. No, it's not okay. Rick interrupted. You were doing something brave and difficult, and instead of supporting you, I mocked you. That says something terrible about me, not you. I hope you can forgive me. Jake thought about holding a grudge, about making Rick suffer for all the snide comments and discounts delivered with pity. But he was too tired for anger, and he'd learned that restoration of houses or relationships required letting go of damage. It's forgiven, Jake said simply. We all make mistakes. All we can do is learn from them. Similar scenes played out over the following weeks. Margaret the librarian apologized in a carefully written note. Tommy from down the street showed up with a six-pack of beer and a red face. Sandra from the corner store actually cried when she tried to express her regret. Jake accepted every apology with grace because he understood something they didn't. He hadn't restored the house to prove them wrong. He'd done it to prove to himself that he could still build something, still matter, still create beauty from ruin. Their mockery had hurt, but their apologies didn't heal him. The work had already done that. The restoration of the Ashford house was completed a year after the discovery of the paintings. Jake hired contractors for the major structural work, but he did all the finish work himself, installing the crown molding, refinishing the floors, painting each room with colors Emma helped choose. The house was transformed. Where there had been rot, now there was solid structure. Where windows had been boarded, now light poured through original glass. Where rooms had been dark and forgotten, now spaces gleamed with careful restoration. But Jake didn't keep it as a private residence. True to his word, he turned it into something larger, the Ashford Turner Veterans Restoration Center. The first floor became a training facility where veterans could learn restoration trades. The second floor housed a small museum dedicated to Walter Ashford's story and the paintings he'd protected. The third floor remained residential, apartments for veterans going through the training program. The official opening was in the spring, 18 months after Jake had first bought the cursed house. Hundreds of people attended, veterans, town residents, the FBI agents who'd worked the case, Dr. Kowalski and Patricia Chen, museum directors who'd received paintings from the collection. Emma, now 14 and impossibly poised, gave a speech about her father that made Jake's throat tight. My dad taught me that restoration isn't just about buildings, she said. It's about believing that broken things can become whole again, that what everyone else gives up on might be exactly what's worth fighting for. He didn't just restore this house. He restored hope for himself, for me, for the families who thought their treasures were lost forever, and now for veterans who need to remember they can still build beautiful things. After the ceremony, Jake found himself alone on the porch, the same porch where he'd sat months ago, mocked and doubted, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. Father Michael joined him, 2 paper cups of wine in hand. You did it, the priest said simply. We did it, Jake corrected. Everyone who believed when it was hard to believe. Emma, who worked beside me. Tyler, who showed up when I needed help. Even you, Father, telling me that crazy was just another word for faith. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the restored house in shades of gold and amber. Jake thought about the journey. From that first morning when he'd stood in front of a rotting Victorian with nothing but hope and stubbornness, through the months of mockery and doubt, to the impossible discovery that had changed everything. Father, Jake said quietly, do you think Walter Ashford knew, somehow, that someone would find what he hid? That it would end the way it did? Father Michael considered. I think he had faith. Maybe not certainty, but faith. That's all any of us have. The belief that doing the right thing matters even when we can't see the outcome. He protected those paintings for 50 years without knowing if anyone would ever appreciate what he'd done. That's not crazy, that's sacred. Jake nodded, understanding. He gave me a gift. Not just the paintings, the whole thing. The mystery that made me dig deeper. The responsibility that made me better. the proof that broken things really can hide treasure underneath. And now you're passing that gift forward, Father Michael said, to every veteran who comes through your program, every person who sees those paintings and learns their story, every kid like Emma who grows up believing that restoration is possible. They finished their wine as stars began to appear, the porch light casting its warm glow, the restored house standing proud behind them, no longer cursed, no longer forgotten, no longer anything but beautiful. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. First veteran starts training Monday. Army vet injured in Syria. Says the house gives him hope. Thought you'd want to know. Jake smiled and typed back, "Tell him the house has a lot of hope to give. It gave me mine back." Emma found him an hour later, still on the porch, lost in thought. She sat beside him, leaning against his shoulder the way she used to when she was younger. "Dad?" she said softly. "Are you happy?" Jake thought about the question. Happy seemed too simple a word for what he felt. Gratitude, purpose, peace, the knowledge that he'd done something that mattered, that his pain had led to something meaningful. "Yeah, baby," he said finally. "I think I am. For the first time since Mom died, I think I'm actually happy." "Good," Emma said. "You deserve it. You deserve all of it." They sat together in the growing darkness, father and daughter, survivors of loss who'd found their way back to something like wholeness through the work of restoration, of a house, of art, of themselves. And Jake understood finally what he'd been searching for all along. Not redemption, not vindication, not even recognition. Just the simple knowledge that broken things could be fixed, that cursed places could be blessed, that a man who'd lost everything could still build something beautiful. The house had given him that, Walter Ashford had given him that, Emma had given him that, and now he'd spend the rest of his life passing it forward, one veteran at a time, one restored building at a time, one life reclaimed from the wreckage of war and loss at a time. Because Jake Turner had learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is knock down a wall everyone tells you to leave alone. Look deeper when everyone says there's nothing to find. Believe in beauty when the whole world sees only ruin. And sometimes, just sometimes, that faith is rewarded beyond your wildest dreams. Not with money, though that helped, but with purpose, with meaning. With the knowledge that you'd honored the past, served the present, and built something for the future. That was worth more than $250 million in paintings. That was worth everything. 3 years after Jake Turner bought a cursed house for $32,000, he stood in the Philadelphia Museum of Art in front of a Van Gogh landscape, surrounded by veterans from his restoration program, and listened to a museum guide explain the painting's journey. This work was stolen by the Nazis in 1941, the guide said. The family who owned it was murdered in the Holocaust. It was recovered after the war but disappeared into bureaucratic limbo. Then a man named Walter Ashford, afraid it would be lost again, hid it in his home in Pennsylvania for 50 years. And finally, a veteran named Jake Turner found it while restoring what everyone called a cursed house, and he made the choice to return it to the world. The guide paused, then added, "The story of this painting, of all the paintings in this exhibition, reminds us that beauty survives when people are brave enough to protect it, that broken things can be restored, that faith sometimes looks like foolishness until the moment it's proven right." Jake felt Emma squeeze his hand. The veterans around him, men and women he'd trained, whose lives he'd helped rebuild, stood a little straighter, seeing their mentor's story told as heroism instead of luck. And somewhere, Jake hoped, Walter Ashford knew that his 50 years of guardianship hadn't been wasted. That his desperate choice to protect beauty had led to this. To paintings displayed with honor, to families reunited with lost treasures, to veterans finding purpose in restoration. Anyone can change the world if they're stubborn enough to dig beneath the surface and brave enough to bring hidden truth into the light. As the museum crowd moved on to the next painting, Jake stayed behind for one more moment, looking at the swirling blues and yellows of Van Gogh's landscape, at the beauty that had survived hatred, neglect, and 70 years of darkness. "Thank you, Walter," he whispered. "Thank you for being crazy enough to believe that this mattered. You were right. It mattered more than you could have known." Then he turned and walked out into the spring sunshine with Emma and his veterans, ready to continue the work of restoration, of buildings, of lives, of faith in the impossible. Because Jake Turner had learned that sometimes the most cursed places hold the most sacred truths, and sometimes the broken man who refuses to give up becomes the one who saves what everyone else thought was lost forever. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that broken things still deserve a chance to shine.